welcome everybody to the Planning Commission, February 26th, 2025. We have a full commission, which is nice. Welcome, everybody.
Your screens may not be on, so you want to touch the button.
Everybody touch the bottom of your screens.
Under and back, yeah, it's red. Sorry about that.
All right. So we will begin with a legislative prayer from Commissioner Larson. And then we'll do a pledge of allegiance.
Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful to be gathered in this capacity and in these roles to serve the city and community. We pray that that will guide us in our thoughts and plans as we have training tonight and as we consider the best interests of the city. And we ask for this in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, packed agenda tonight, guys. Business item number 1, Planning Commission training, Land Use 101, with an auspicious guest. So, do we want to start out, or should we just defer right to
I think the only thing, and maybe I'd let even Cindy lead in on it, because she's the one that kind of, I guess, asked or had a discussion about. So maybe you can talk about, Cindy, how it evolved that we got him here.
It honestly evolved that I was part of a meeting where it was like a seminar online, and you were a resource for training for the Planning Commission, and I thought, what a great opportunity for the Planning Commissioners to have somebody from the state come down. So I reached out to you, and we had a good discussion about absolutely.
Great, yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Very quick.
State law does say that planning commissions have to have 4 hours of training every single year. One of those hours needs to be of general duties and responsibilities, which is actually what we're going to cover here tonight. So the rest of that training, can be provided by a whole plethora of items, videos online. It can be training that's offered by staff, items of that nature. But yeah, it's unique to the state of Utah, but it's so planning commissioners always feel very comfortable in their roles and their responsibilities, which is why they have that. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here to go over that 1 hour of required. Do we have any newer planning commission members? Somebody was talking about their $1,000 gifts. I'm assuming maybe that's...
Oh, yeah, that's me. I still keep talking about it, dreaming about it.
Maybe will it to fruition. Usually the first hour, it is required by a planning commissioner before they can actually take any, but then annually thereafter, it is a requirement within the state. So it's just self-reported and all that fun stuff. But so yeah, what we're going to cover tonight is Land Use Planning 101. We're just going to talk about state law, some basics within planning, best practices that go along with that, and everybody's favorite newer subject, the subdivision process, which has just been flawless with 0 issues anywhere in the state, right? So we're going to touch on that. We're going to talk about any of the challenges that you may have at your agency, and hopefully be able to talk about any of the areas that were kind of nebulous or maybe and where there's actually a lot more flexibility within the process, I think, than many agencies felt that there was going to be, but there certainly was that intent going into it. So at any point throughout the presentation, jump in and ask questions, throw tomatoes if you want, anything like that. I will say, try not to hit the shirt. I'm in blue today because BYU is playing and they're on a 4-game win streak, so I'm hoping that's gonna, yeah.
That's a good point. They're playing like as we speak.
About
20 minutes.
It's
You can wrap it up here pretty quick.
19 minutes to tip, which is, I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as we can here.
That's just second half.
I'm always afraid to just admit that straight out at a public meeting, especially when you're anywhere within, close to the University of Utah campus. So, but it is what it is. I know we probably have a Washington Husky fan over here, so.
Absolutely we do. No.
See, I knew it.
A Illini fan.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, guys. My name is Rob Terry. I'm the statewide land use training director. I'm housed out of the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman, but I'm the only non-attorney in the office, which, while I think that's a great thing, I also have to say that the attorneys in the Ombudsman's office are fantastic. They're absolutely great to work with. Next slide, please. How many of you guys, by raise of hand, are familiar with what the Ombudsman's office is and what they do? Okay, so about half. So the Ombudsman's Office is very unique to the state of Utah, the Property Rights Ombudsman's Office. Ombudsmans are common in other states, more so in the eastern U.S. than you may see in the western U.S., even though the western U.S. you're starting to see more and more of them. They really serve as that independent, neutral party that can be able to help assist with certain items wherever there's a rub between something in the private market and then something on the private property side or government side, whenever you're going to see a rub between those items. The state of Utah, about 15 years ago, when the state was really starting to experience that sustained, quick growth that has been constant ever since, could see very clearly that there was a lot of instances where you were having a rub between a government interest, a government need, and private property rights. Typically, the most common example of that is going to be something like with eminent domain, right? As you're seeing growth, a street needs to widen and there needs to be taking of property on whatever side of the street or sometimes both sides of the street as they're looking to expand this public facility for the public good, and yet it impacts individual private property owners. And there wasn't any agency within the state that could step in and say, we're neutral, we're independent, and we're here to ensure, A, that the government is conducting their business in the way that it's supposed to, and B, that there's a resource for private property owners to reach out to and to say, am I being treated fairly? What are my rights? What are my responsibilities? To ensure that everybody was following the appropriate rules and being treated fairly, right? Outside of the very expensive and time-extensive litigation process that often those things are going to. I was a planner in California for almost 20 years, and so I can tell you, hopefully I'll be able to say here tonight a lot of things to not do. One of those things that I think that they certainly could have used there would be something like a private property ombudsman. But the state, when they were established, there was really 4 edicts that were given. First and foremost, that was to provide information and education. And that's both to private property owners and to local agencies, to inform them about state law processes, ensure that they understood what they were supposed to be doing, what the roles and the responsibilities were. And primarily, that's my responsibility within the office. Then you have the attorneys that will serve as negotiation liaisons. That's between private property owners and local or state officials. Sometimes it's a UDOT project, sometimes it's a local agency project. And they will serve as that independent, neutral third party that can come in and help there be that good communication between the parties. 2 of the tools that they will utilize for that, first are mediation. Typically, you're going to see that with eminent domain cases. But mediation simply just means the party that goes in there and can help as they're communicating, ensuring that there is progress that's moving forward, right? Trying to get everybody onto that same page. One of the tools that they use that's extremely helpful is something referred to as an advisory opinion. What an advisory opinion is, it can be requested by a private property owner, a local agency, an interested party, and they can say, here's this issue right here. We want you to do this advisory opinion on it, where everybody involved will hand over all the facts of that case. The ombudsman or the attorneys within the office will then take all of those facts. They will then compare them to state law, to legal precedent, to best practices, and they will put together an analysis that says, if this item were to go before a judge, this is likely the way that the judge would rule. And it helps people be able to come up with better mediation tactics. Oftentimes, it can help both sides come to agreement on something without having to go through the very costly and very time-exhaustive litigation process, right? Because if you know, well, taking into all that same process that a judge is going to utilize and putting all that into an advisory opinion, if this is likely the way that that would end up coming out, then we can skip that process and we can say, can we find middle ground right now where we can agree on items? So they're great tools. They've done over 300 of them now over the 15-year period and constantly have, I would say, anywhere between 20 and 40 of them on the docket that they're just consistently working through and all throughout the state.
Do the people get charged for requesting an advisory opinion?
So there is a small charge. It is $150, which compared to, I mean, $150 in all honesty wouldn't even cover like 1 hour of a land use attorney's time.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And I would say that the one challenge, of course, is that when you have, we only have 3 attorneys in the office, and so it's not uncommon for an advisory opinion to take several months to go through the entire process. But if you've ever been associated with any type of land use litigation, it's not uncommon for those to drag out 18, 24 months plus, right? So it is still faster, of course, than that process. and certainly a lot more cost-effective, right? Next slide. Okay, so I always want to make sure that everybody knows about this resource that the state of Utah has. It is referred to as the Land Use Academy of Utah. Commonly, the acronym is LUAU, because I'm sure as you guys are seeing on a planning commission now, planners love their acronyms, right? So it's got to be catchy, it's got to be fun, it's got to be everything. So that's where LUAU came from. But it's a great resource, and it serves as the home, that central repository for anything planning related within the state of Utah. The history of it about in 2015 was created by the Utah League of Cities and Towns, and initially it was put in place to help newly elected officials and newly appointed planning commissioners really kind of get their feet wet and understand the basic roles and responsibilities. Over time, though, it started to mold and turn into more about where planning practitioners were also interested in going in and looking at things like examples and templates and best practices. And so now it just serves as that home of everything planning related. You could be brand new to planning, and it'll give you things like definitions and contact lists and explanations about what agencies do what, all the way down to if you can be a planner for 20 plus years, and there's going to be an item in there where there's best practices and white papers that get really into the weeds of topics and everything. So I mean, it covers the entire spectrum, and it's updated almost every single day. It's rare that I actually have a day where there isn't another resource being provided to me where someone is saying, can you please place this on the Land Use Academy website? And I'm the person that manages it. So it's a great resource. It was updated just in the last year. Next slide. So if you go to the homepage and you see Springdale, Utah, you know you're in the right place. If you see one that it looks a little more dated, hit the refresh button. Every once in a while, Google will kind of show the old website platform for some odd reason. But if you hit refresh, it'll immediately go to that one. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into the fun stuff, the reason why we're really here, the planning basics. Next slide. Everything planning law related in the state of Utah has the foundation of the Land Use Development and Management Act. Again, commonly referred to as LUDMA, because got to have the acronym, right? I wouldn't say that one's as attractive as LUAU personally, but it is what it is. This sets that foundational item for every single legislative action that the state takes to then set the guardrails for planning. What's extremely important to understand is that the state acknowledges that the best planning and implementation happens at the local level. And while there needs to be guardrails to set out that overall platform of how you plan and the surroundings in which planning actually happens, getting into the fine details of that best happens at the local level. So I won't go through each one of these items here, but I always like to point out the top three, because as a planner myself, whenever I find myself in an application, and maybe even sometimes getting confused within an application or the details start to become a little overwhelming, I pull back to these three items, because in my mind it goes right back to the why. Why are we planning? What are we really looking at? So when the state set the foundation, first and foremost, it was to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of each individual community and the state at large. Second, to promote the prosperity of each one of those communities, and then of course the state at large. And then third, to improve the morale, peace, good order, comfort, convenience, and aesthetics of each municipality and each municipality's present and future inhabitants and businesses. That to me really encompasses what planning is. It's being aware of what you have on the ground right now, the pros and the cons of what those items might be, the things that you are trying to protect and enhance and ensure, maintain, but then also setting that compass due north for the areas that you want to head in, the things that you're trying to work towards, right? That's the whole point of planning. And minus putting effort into that type of planning process, you simply end up getting wherever you end up, right? Without having some type of roadmap that you're putting into place. Next slide. Anybody ever experienced anything like this at your planning commission meetings? That ever happened?
No, never here.
Never, right?
No.
I figured not. Everywhere else in the world except for Centerville.
Oh, for sure.
Never happens here. I saw this meme a couple months ago, and it was one of those, like, I started laughing so hard I about fell out of my chair, and then realized that it was turning into like a panic anxiety laugh. Because oftentimes that is what you are up against when you are trying to help community members go through the planning process. And the biggest challenge to planning, I have found in my experience, is having really good communication with the public for them to understand what the process is, and oftentimes what it's not, or where they may be within a process and not understanding the type of influence or decisions that can be made. Those are the type of things that we're going to talk about tonight, differences between administrative and legislative and everything that we lay out in place to get there, to hopefully turn that frown upside down, right? So we'll see if that can happen here. Okay, so first and foremost, you start with your general plan. So the general plan, if you are an incorporated municipality, you're required to have a general plan within the state of Utah. And a general plan is a mandated document that will guide the growth and the development of your community. It's really setting that vision, the goals and the policies that you want to be able to get to. It's a long-range document. It's typically going to be out 10 to 20 years in the future is the planning horizon, although there is nothing in state law that says that it has to cover X amount of time or it can't exceed X amount of time. That is up to the community. Some communities, especially in the rural areas, theirs might look out a little bit further because they're not experiencing as much growth pressure. Some of the more urbanized areas, theirs might actually pull back significantly because they may actually be significantly built out already, and what they're looking at is a lot more infill or redevelopment as opposed to greenfield development and growth and expanding on the corner. So it's really up to the community, but you want your general plan to fit your community and what it is that you are looking to do. It is very important to know that it's intended to be a living document, and what that means is don't look at it as something that's etched in stone. If community values, community visions, community opportunities even change, you should be looking at the general plan and talking about, are we interested in some type of change or adjustment here? There may be a new industry that was not on the city's radar when the general plan was initially adopted or even amended, and now all of a sudden that industry is interested in being within your community, and the community is interested in welcoming that industry in. You would want to take a look at amending your general plan to ensure that everything is still going to be in line to allow that to happen while still trending in the growth areas and directions that you want to be able to go. Next. Okay, so then you have your land use ordinances. Your land use ordinances are the written law that is duly adopted by the local legislative body or your city council. Those are then going to actually get into the direct regulation of land development within your community, and they're going to include items like your planning ordinances, zoning ordinances, development ordinances, subdivision ordinances, everything of that nature. So when someone says a land use ordinance, it's kind of a collection of all of those ordinances that deal with the design, the development, the construction of your community. Some communities have everything just one land use ordinance and it has everything in it. Others have multiple ordinances, right? But they're all going to fall under that. And of course, the best practice whenever you're dealing with any type of land use regulation through an ordinance is you want that ordinance to implement your general plan, right? That's why you went through that whole process. So now make sure that you're implementing the type of policies within your land use ordinance that are in line with your general plan and are taking you forward in the direction that you want to go. Next. One of the most common, of course, is zoning. Zoning really gets into the local regulations that are going to manage the look and feel and the actual operation of your community. They're going to control items like land use, density, physical dimensions of your development. The history of zoning is that it was put in place to avoid conflicts between certain land uses. So around the industrial age, you started seeing things like steel mills and things of that nature that were actually starting to pop up or operate right adjacent to or sometimes even within areas where residents were living, right, in residential type of areas. So you can imagine the conflicts that you had there between safety and noise and health and all the impacts that had. So that's the history of zoning where that started coming in and separating out some of these uses. Over the years, zoning, of course, has become much more intense, and in some communities is pretty simple, and some communities can get very, very complex. But it is up to the community how they're interested in looking at their zoning and implementing zoning within their community. The best practice, of course, very similar to any of your land use ordinances, is you want to implement your general plan within your zoning as well. So when you're taking a look at your zoning, does that fit in line with what your general plan map says? Are your zone designations appropriate? Do they overlay properly? Utah, there's really two types of states when it comes to general plan and zoning. There's states that require consistency between those two items, and then there's states that do not require consistency. Utah at this time does not require consistency between a general plan and your zoning ordinance, but I will say that the state legislature is beginning to have discussions about whether or not they do want to actually become consistent with that. And so while that is for some communities a significant change, there's a lot of communities in Utah where they're just consistent because they saw that as a best practice and they implemented it. But just know that's something that could be on the horizon for change. Yeah.
What would that look like exactly?
So what that would mean then is when you go through the process to adopt or to amend your general plan, you would then have to go into your zoning ordinance and ensure that your zoning map, your land use map, is consistent with your general plan map. So that would be something like, say if a general plan had identified an area as single-family residential, right? Then you're going to look at that same area within your zoning map and you're going to say the zoning designations here, are they consistent with single-family residential? Whether that's R16, R110, whatever it might be, is it consistent? Is there consistency there? It can be a little more art than science in some instances, but really you want, the consistency would simply be what's identified in your general plan. Does your zoning implement that by and large?
So if there was a zoning map amendment, like a rezone that occurred, would we have to go back and somehow edit our general plan, or?
If someone were to come in, say you had a general plan that had the single-family residential, your zoning was single-family residential, and someone came in and they were saying, we're looking for a mixed-use designation, or we're looking for even a multifamily designation, then if there was consistency required, then yes, a community would need to go back and actually concurrently do a general plan amendment and a zone code, or a zone change.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many states do that? Do you know on the top of your head?
I would say, I mean, offhand, those that I know absolutely do it, you're probably looking at 15.
Yeah, that seems pretty intense.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's, truthfully, and I hope this doesn't come off wrong, the majority of the blue states,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
actually have that as a requirement.
Interesting.
Yeah, California, Oregon, Washington, whole western, yeah, they're all like that. Okay, next one. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the roles and responsibilities. So first, what is the role of city or a town council? So they serve as your legislative, or the reason why I have that bolded and underlined, because to me, it makes more sense to say decision-making body than it does oftentimes to say legislative body. They are the decision makers for your community. The type of decisions that they're typically going to be looking at are things like the adoption of your general plan, any amendment to that general plan, the adoption of any of your land use ordinances, your regulations, your design standards. That's, of course, anything that's being proposed or amending anything that's existing. Same thing for zoning, annexation decisions, whether or not they're looking to expand the boundary of your community, sometimes even de-annex, in all honesty, if they're looking to pull back within. All of those items require legislative action. And then, of course, the adoption of any fee, development impact fees, anything, any fee that's going to go out to the public that is going to be charged to the general public requires legislative action by the decision-making body, by the legislative body. Next slide. So what about a planning commission? So planning commissions are required within the state of Utah. So if you are a municipality, you have a city or a town council, you are required to have a planning commission. But planning commissions serve in typically an advisory role. And the commission is going to review and they're going to make recommendations to the legislative body. And you'll note that the list up there is very similar to what the legislative body is going to act on. And the reason why is because the planning commission is going to review those items. They're then going to make recommendations to the legislative body, to the city council. And the city council is then going to actually take the legislative or decision-making actions on those items, weighing in the planning commission's recommendation, right? So you have your general plan amendments, your land use regulations. Then there's even review of certain applications to address consistency with adopted land use regulations. That's typically where you're going to see the biggest difference between city council, what they're doing, and the planning commission. Because if the planning commission has been designated as the body that is responsible for reviewing certain items, then you're typically going to review those, oftentimes even take approval action, and the city council may only be involved if something is appealed, right? So things like, it can range across the state, but it could be things like conditional use permits or something of that nature are usually the most common ones that you see there. Questions? Okay, so what is a land use authority? So a land use authority is a person, a board, commission, an agency, or a body that can include the local legislative body, meaning the city council, that is designated to act by the local legislative body upon a land use application. If The city council, the local legislative body, has not identified a person, board, commission, agency, or body to serve as that land use authority for certain applications, then by default, it goes back to the city council, to the local legislative authority. Then they will be the land use authority. So no matter what, one of those two bodies is always going to be serving as the land use authority. If there's a land use decision being made, it's either going to default to the city council, or they will have assigned the responsibility for review and action on those items to another person, a body, or typically a planning commission, something of that nature.
I have a question.
Yep.
Do we have one, or is it just default back to us?
It just depends on what the assigned role is by code.
Yeah.
So conditional uses are decision-making of the planning commission, even site plans are decision-making of the planning commission. But like a commercial subdivision, the decision maker is the city council.
Yeah, and so it'll be identified for whatever the type of application is, then you have the land use authority that is assigned by that. If the city council has not assigned a different person, agency, body, or commission, then by default it's them. If they have, then it's you. And like Mike said, CUPs, commercial, site plan,
plans.
commercial subdivision, those type of items, you've been designated as the land use authority for those items. Now, the state, as part of the subdivision process that was just implemented, the new subdivision process for single-family, two-family, and townhome, thank you, I was spacing the third one there. They now have something referred to as an administrative land use authority. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but that's not to be confused with, because while that still is a land use authority, it is a carve-out of land use authority, and it gets a little more specific just for those applications. Next. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between a legislative and administrative decision-making. So legislative decisions are typically going to involve the making of laws that are then going to be applied within a community. And they are based upon weighing broad and competing policy considerations, right? So everybody's input from the community matters. Opinions, preferences, all of it. They matter at that time for the legislative body to then decide what type of law they want to create and or amend. And then it's going to be the rule of law for that local area. Typically, those are going to be things like the adoption, the amendment of the general plan. You'll note the list is the same as the previous section that we had gone on there. So those type of legislative actions. Next. What are some of the considerations that need to be made when legislative decisions are being considered? So first, as it should always be, you want to make sure that you're not violating any applicable state or federal law, right? And that can sound really scary, in all honesty, even when there is instances where a local agency inadvertently gets sideways with something like that. There is always the way to be able to back out of those items and make sure that they are addressed appropriately. So please don't be afraid of that. While that does serve as that foundation all the time, don't be afraid, so scared that like I need to memorize all 10,000 pages of federal law and 20,000 pages of state law. It's not that scary. Yes.
Is there an instance or a time that has kind of like reoccurred over and over again that you can think of, like one particular law that you're like, everyone seems to mess up on this or is more relevant than?
I would say the most common one that I've seen is that agencies, because for many, many years, local agencies could actually have design standards that would prohibit certain type of items. Like they could say, you cannot use stucco as exterior cladding within our community because that's not an aesthetic they wanted to see. Or they had a certain color palette or things of that nature. And a few years back, the state legislature said that in the push for more housing and more affordability, it's no longer permitted for local agencies to have those type of design standards, or to say you can't use, you have to use certain items or you cannot use certain things. I would say that that's probably the one that I've seen most common, as agencies have then realized that that was a law that was passed and they either didn't know it, didn't understand it, and oftentimes when they're then crafting conditions of approval for a development that is coming in, it will have something in there, and it's usually the developer that you can't require that, right? And then there's the, oops, but again, it's one of those items where, a developer can't come in and just say, I'm going to sue. I mean, I guess they could. I doubt that they would. But if they call into question something like that and an agency looks at it and says, yes, that actually would violate state law, those items can simply be redlined and just removed. And you can say, we removed that item because that would have violated state law. And that can be the end of the conversation.
That's a very interesting one that you brought up.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, I would point out again that that is for residential.
Okay.
So,
there we go.
yes.
That was because I was like, this is something that
no.
me and Mike really need to talk about.
No, and that's,
Okay.
that's where it gets back into the housing affordability and supply issue to try to get more units in place as efficiently and quickly as possible.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Makes more sense now.
Yeah, sorry for the inadvertent heart attack I gave you there.
You are all good.
Okay, and then that second point, if it's reasonably debatable that the decision could advance the general welfare or public interest and it is consistent with the State Land Use Development Management Act, courts are typically going to uphold the decision that the local legislative body made as legal, right? And that goes back to the understanding that local agencies, planning happens best at the local level. And the state has given that authority to local agencies to do their own local planning. And so if you can clearly show that it is, and that's a legal term, that's why it's in quotations, the reasonably debatable, that's the test that they give to it. If they could look at the record of the action that was taken, and a reasonable person could look at that and ascertain from that, the reason why this decision was made is because clearly they documented that they believe it's in the general interest, the best general interest for the community, and it is in line with the State Land Use Development Management Act. It's not violating anything there. Courts are typically going to say the local legislative authority has the ability to set their own laws and their own rules and regulations. When a legislative body is looking to take those actions, though, it's really important that they attempt to strike a balance between the public interest and private property rights. Utah is a very strong private property rights state, and so there is a lot of deference given to private property rights. And we'll talk a little bit later when you get into the administrative type of roles and responsibilities where that comes into play and why that's really important, because then you will see that courts oftentimes will side with the private property owner on items once rules have been set and they are in place. So, next slide. So what is the role of the public in legislative decisions? In my 20 years of planning, I think that this is most often the area that is misunderstood by members of the public. Whether it hasn't been communicated very well, they didn't understand it, maybe they didn't hear it, whatever it might be, their role in legislative decisions and then their role in administrative decisions most often is where frustration comes in from the general public and their really lack of understanding of what type of influence they can have and should have at these two levels. So at the legislative level, the legislative body, the city council, they need to take into consideration input from the public. And that can include opinions, preferences, all of it. All of that is important and needs to be weighed by the city council. It's up to the city council how much weight they want to give to those preferences and those opinions. But it's extremely important that people are given the opportunity to express those before they're then going to be setting any of those laws. We're going to pass ordinances that are going to set standards and regulations. So extremely important. Next one. So what about administrative? Once you have laws that are set in place, it is then the role of the administrative team to then implement those laws, those regulations. And so that's why administrative decisions are generally going to involve applying existing codes to a particular development proposal. And it's going to be based on the individual facts of whatever application or proposal you're seeing before you at that time. Typically, those are going to be items like the brand new ones, subdivisions for single family, two family, and townhome. Items like conditional use permits, site plans, building permits, variances. Notice these are things that you as a planning commission, you hear fairly often, right? You guys are administering the rules that have already been adopted by the city council. You then have basically your guidebook, right? Here's the rules. You use that as the lens to take a look at each individual project or application before you, and you're then determining whether or not it meets the rules or it does not meet the rules. And you're then taking action based upon whether or not, if it meets the rules, an item is approved. If it does not meet the rules, an item is not approved, right? And it goes through that general process. Next. So what are the considerations that you have to make when you're going through the administrative? Same exact as the last one. Make sure you're not violating any state or federal law. Sounds scary, but it really is not that scary, and you guys have great staff here to make sure that you're avoiding those landmines. And even if you don't, I'm going to assume they're still just amazing, right? of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah, without question. The Land Use Authority must apply plain language in land use regulations. And now I love this one, it's actually listed in state law, and it's really more of an encouragement. What that means is, it can be so easy to get stuck in plannerese, right, or government speak on items. For us, for planners, when I say us, it typically ends up being that acronym thing. Like, you can overload acronyms to the point where people are like, oh my gosh, I'm not even 100% sure what you're talking about. So when you're having communication with the general public, try to talk to them in as much of that plain language that's easy to understand as possible, because it can just simply make a process be a lot easier to digest. It's also important to note that if an application meets the requirements, if it meets the rules and regulations you have in place, you don't need to stress over any additional details or any additional discussion. It should be approved, and it should be done in a timely manner so that you can move on to the next
I
application.
just add a comment to that, Rob. With this one, it's interesting, and cities grapple with this, to what you said, it's not a, we like this, we don't like this. If it meets the requirements of the code, whether we like it or not,
Yep.
we're under obligation to approve it. And I
That
think
is
cities
correct.
get tripped up on that a lot, even today, even though this tradition has been established for 10+ years or 15 years in Utah. And we still see that, so I just want to make sure the planning commission remembers that it's, does it meet the requirement? Yes, check. It's not, we like this, we don't like this.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is. And that can be really tough as a planning commission. And in all honesty, oftentimes planning commissioners become involved in the planning commission because they went through a process with something that was often challenging or even frustrating for them. And they say, I want to get involved because I don't want somebody else to experience this, right? That's been my experience with a lot of planning commissioners. And it's only when they get onto the planning commission that then they start learning more and more about that administrative versus the legislative type of processes. And it can be challenging, and that we'll talk about in a second, where I think the public has at large a general misunderstanding about that, and why oftentimes they can go to that patriot type of mentality, and rightly so. Okay. This next one right here, when a regulation does not plainly restrict a land use application, or somebody could reasonably read it to support a different interpretation, then the land use authority must interpret and apply the regulation to favor the proposal in the land use application. So I'd said a couple minutes ago that Utah's a very private property rights heavy state. That's where this is going to come into play right here. While courts are typically going to look at decisions and laws that are being made at the local level and give deference to the local agency and say, you have the right to make laws for your own community, they're going to look at the record and how they did that. Once those laws are in place, they are then going to actually give more deference to the private property owner for use of their property to the greatest degree possible. So if there are instances or activities that a community feels very strongly about, you want to make sure that the language that's within your codes gives both staff and anyone acting in that administrative capacity the ability and enough of that direction to take the appropriate action. Otherwise, if there is a challenge, a court is going to look at a code, and if a code is nebulous, they're going to look at an item, they're going to say, they're typically going to find in favor of the private property owner being able to utilize their private property. Now, there are some caveats to that, right? Public health and safety, things of that nature can be overriding considerations. But you want to make sure that you have enough detail within your code that administratively you can then implement it the way that the intent was for it to be implemented. I would also encourage people at the same time, don't be so specific that you then end up hamstringing the administration as well, right? Seek to have that really good balance.
Well, and can I add one more comment to
Yeah.
that too? That's why the role of the planning commission is so helpful, especially when we're looking at changing codes and making recommendations to the city council. Because even if staff, we bring something and you say, this doesn't read the way you meant, staff, or I can't make sense of this, you're our first test to understand how the general public's looking at it, to make sure we're trying to get it right when it goes to the city council, right? So it's really important to call us, or just like we've done on the few tests we've had over the year recently, this doesn't work or this does work, so that we can try to get that right when we take it to council. So we do appreciate that guidance and that push and pull from you as we're working through that, and hope that will continue.
Absolutely. And to Mike's point, if there's instances where there is an item within your land use ordinances that seems to be a consistent tripping point, then that likely should be an item where the planning commission and staff should start having discussions about, Do we want to see a change in language here to make sure that it's going to be easier to administer, it's going to look better? While your land use ordinances and you know, the general laws for your community are going to have more weight right now, I would use that term, than the general plan would, they also should be understood that they are living as well. And if it's appropriate for those items to change and to be amended and adjusted, by all means, you know, take a look at them and do that. Okay, and then I always point this out for every single local agency. I think it is absolutely best practice at every level, whether you're legislative or administrative. But the land use authority must always support their decision with substantial evidence. And what that means is whatever action that you're looking to take, keep in your mind, okay, what's going to be in the record here? So if someone that had nothing to do with this situation were to come in and they were to read the minutes, read the record of the decision that was made, why it was made, the data behind it and everything, would it make sense to them? Would they be able to, a reasonable person be able to look at that and say, I can understand why this item was approved because it met all of the criteria within the land use ordinance? Or I can understand why this was not approved because it failed to meet the criteria in this area and in this area. You just want to make sure that you have great evidence that's all going to be wrapped up into that package so that at any future point, anybody that's needing to look at that can be able to have that reasonable timeline and everything that's going to connect all the dots for them.
And that's also where the findings will come into play often with
100%.
decisions, right? But
Yes.
the findings are that substantial evidence that we're
Absolutely.
trying to enunciate, yeah.
Yep.
So just a question on that, what's considered the record, if you will? I mean, is it, you know, the agenda, minutes,
minutes.
application, emails between staff and the applicant? Would that be part of the record as well, or?
I almost would feel like it'd go with the decision-making of the body of the planning commission or the council
Like the
and the
court- all the
facts
court
that are brought
approved,
forward in the
yeah.
conversation. And then that evidence and those findings, I would think would be more of the record.
Yeah, I would say it's probably best practice when you're thinking about what would be considered evidence or substantial evidence is going to be anything that is presented during an open public meeting.
Yeah.
And any of the supporting documentation, even though it may not be expressly discussed, if it was submitted as part of the application or something of that nature. Emails amongst staff and things of that nature, you're typically not going to see any of that type of stuff come into play unless something is going through a litigation type of process, or if there is a public records request, you know, something like that made. Any of those items, anything, of course, that's done in the name of the public can be, with certain exceptions, can be the matter of a public records request, but typically it's only going to go that way if there's a pretty consistent problem.
So, yeah, I mean, the main thing would be the staff report, you know, and then any public comment or public hearing. But sometimes staff puts in an email from the city engineer in the staff report or in the agenda item, so now it is part of the record. You know, so you want to think about that, but typically if the engineer is saying you need to do this, this, and this, it's in the record that it's not a complete application or that it still needs to, you know, comply with these engineering requirements.
Next slide. Okay. This right here is where I think the vast majority of the frustration from the public comes in when they are dealing with the difference between legislative and administrative and typically are not aware that there is even a difference like that, right? So the land use authority, when you were talking administrative decisions, cannot rely on public opinion or preferences that are being brought forward. Oftentimes, someone is going to come in and they are going to be frustrated with an application, concerned about something. It's usually something that's being built in their neighborhood, maybe right next to them, or something of that nature. And the issue is typically going to be, I don't want a 7-Eleven on the corner right next to my house, or something like that, right, as an example. The Planning Commission at that time, you are taking action on items administratively. So if this was a conditional use permit, if that is already zoned for the appropriate type of commercial, and they're doing a conditional use permit that is going to address the mitigating factors that they have to address, and that's it. But the application checks all of the boxes within the rules. The Planning Commission cannot say, we're not going to approve this, simply because someone is standing here and they're saying that they don't like it. Their opinions and their preferences can't impact the situation at that level because the rules are already set. And that is all the Planning Commission can utilize as the lens to then look at an individual application. Now, to a member of the public, that often comes off as, you don't care what I think and you don't care how I feel. And so the communication with members of the public to ensure that they understand the difference between that administrative and that legislative, and having conversations with their city council, talking about changes of zone. This is why items like the general plan matter, that set that vision, and then the zoning that's going to be put in place to try to implement that vision, right? But oftentimes people don't even know about a project until it's at an administrative type of approval level. And so communicating with them and ensuring that they understand that, I think, is extremely important. Even though the vast majority of the time there's still going to be frustration about that, it's extremely important to be transparent with them and to ensure that there is that communication about what the scope of the Planning Commission's role is and what actions they can and can't take and what has to guide those.
Well, and Rob, to that point, that's why I brought that up earlier too. I think that we, even as staff and even as planning commission or council, grapple with those same feelings.
Oh,
too.
absolutely, 100%.
We may get something and we get caught, but we see by zoning, we've said it's okay. Now we can go and correct it after the fact with that petition. But that petition, if we don't like it, we have to work with it administratively because we allow it.
Yeah, when someone submits a complete application and they pay a fee for an application, that by law is then considered complete, and what that does is it's referred to as it vests them, vesting, right? So they submit a complete application, all the information that's required in an application, and they pay the associated fee with it. They have now locked in their right to have that application reviewed with the rules that were in place the day that it was considered complete, right? And so even if staff all of a sudden looks at something, which absolutely happens, looks at something and goes, I don't think that's what we wanted to see, the fact of the matter is the rules were in place and that's what it needs to be paired with. You can then have conversations about making changes after that item, but that item has the right to now go through its process with the rules that were in place the day that they submitted that complete application. Yes, and the land use authority, when you're making administrative decisions, while you can't take public opinion and preferences into account, you absolutely can take input from the public for fact-finding and evidence-based type of items, right? So if someone were to come in and they were to point out something within that application that maybe staff hadn't noticed, or something of that nature, they could say, hey, there's actually a 10-foot setback on these side yards here, and I noticed that on the site plan, this one is only 8 feet, right? Those items can absolutely be taken into account, because then the Planning Commission, you're talking about the rules that are in place. And so if someone's pointing to a rule that is not being met, or if there's questions about a rule being met, then by all means, that back and forth in that conversation is absolutely appropriate. But the opinions and the preferences, right? I don't like that type of architecture, I don't like stucco, I don't like those type of things cannot be part of that conversation if they're not expressly within your code to have that. Questions, concerns? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the administrative land use authority. So we talked about what a land use authority is, now the administrative land use authority. And this one applies only to those subdivision applications for single-family, two-family, or townhome subdivisions. So an administrative land use authority is an individual, a board, a commission appointed or employed by a municipality, including municipal staff. So it can be a staff member, or it can be the municipal planning commission. So you guys can also be the land use authority for certain items and the administrative land use authority. What it cannot include is a municipal legislative body or any member of that body, meaning no city council member or the city council as a whole can serve at any time as the administrative land use authority for any single-family, two-family, or townhome subdivision applications. The reason why the state had taken that angle goes all the way back again to that trying to streamline the permitting process for single-family, two-family, and townhome developments, trying to address the supply and demand issue. Remove as much of the red tape as possible, remove the politics out of a lot of those situations, make them administrative in nature, and tell local agencies you guys need to come up with good, solid rules for your community, and then allow administrative decisions to take place for those rules, for those type of applications right there. And by removing the legislative body out of that process, the intent there was to remove the political, the opinion, and the preference items out of each one of those individual decisions, and just simply have rules. You're applying those rules administratively, work through them a little bit faster. I think that there was a lot of agencies that were really, really concerned about what that was going to mean for them and how that was going to work. I think there's also even been growing pains as it's been implemented, because there's no such thing as a policy that ever gets put into place that is absolutely perfect and doesn't have some nuances and some challenges with it. So most agencies have been working really hard through those items, but the general feedback that I've heard from most agencies is, while the change process was a pain and scary and nerve-wracking, that they're starting to see things that they like better about it, while still addressing some of those challenges and some of the negatives that came along with it. And so I think that's important to point to. I think the state understands it's certainly not perfect, but that's what the legislature gave, and so that's what we're implementing. And we will go more into the process here in the following slides. Next slide. Okay, so it was Senate Bill 174 in the 2023 session that actually made these changes. So first, what it did was an applicant can now request a pre-application meeting. It is not required, but they can request that of staff. And if they do request it, then staff needs to schedule that within 15 days. Schedule doesn't mean they need to have that meeting within 15 days. That means that they need to get it on the calendar within 15 days. So it's not saying that if you pass that 15 days and they requested it, you're now having a problem as far as actually having the meeting. It just means there needs to be communication with the applicant within a 15 business day window to get that meeting scheduled. So next would then be the initial review of the preliminary plat. That must be completed within 15 business days of receiving a complete application. If your municipality has a population of 5,000 or more, which of course in Centerville you do. Note the term there, of course, complete application. That goes back again to that item of a complete application means the application includes all of the required information and any applicable fee paid. If someone comes in with an application that is not complete, even something as basic as the application is complete as far as everything that's required, but they didn't sign it, not a complete application, right? Every single item within that application has to be addressed appropriately, and any associated fee needs to be paid. When you put those two items together, now you have a complete application, and that starts the first review cycle. And I'll talk about the review cycles in a second. The review of a final plat must be completed within 20 days of receiving a complete final plat application if a municipality has 5,000 or more people. So what about the review cycles? You can only have a maximum of 4 review cycles that are being permitted. So a review cycle starts, cycle 1 is going to start when you get that complete application from someone. You now have that 15 business days to do the initial review of their preliminary plat, right? You then, the local agency will review it. They will then provide comments, responses back to the applicant, let them know if there's any deficiencies in anything, items that need to be addressed, things of that nature. The local agency is required within 15 business days to get that back to the applicant. The applicant is not held to any time in which they have to then respond to that, but they remain in that review cycle that they are in until they respond to staff or to the agency's comments on everything totally and completely. If they come back, if there was, say, 15 bullet points that needed to be addressed, they have to respond to all 15 of those bullet points. When they hand that back in, that concludes that review cycle, and the next review cycle would start again. If there was 15 bullet points and they only addressed 12 of them, they're still in the same review cycle. So staff would be completely within the law to say these 3 items were not addressed, and therefore the second or the third, the consequent review cycle, has not started yet. You're still in that one. The only time limit that staff has is that initial review period, to review what it was in that review cycle and get it back to the applicant. The onus is then on the applicant to have a complete response back to the agency before that review cycle then completes. Does that make sense? Okay. You can go through a maximum of 4 of those review cycles. Now that said, if you have an applicant that comes in, they submit a complete application, the city does a review of it, they send it back to the applicant, there's 5 items that need to be addressed. The applicant responds to all 5 of those items, addresses all 5 of them, hands it back in. That second review cycle has started, and in the second review, they find everything has been addressed. You don't have to go through a 3rd or a 4th review cycle. There's just the maximum of 4. But at any point in any of the review cycles, if it is deemed complete and appropriate and meets the regulations, move through the approval process. That's really the entire point behind trying to take it administratively, is to try to be as expeditious as possible. And while an applicant should always respond, of course, to everything within writing anyways as a best practice, and to complete that review cycle, it is critical that if there's anything that they disagree with, that staff needs to make sure that the applicant understands that has to be submitted in writing, or it cannot be considered as being disagreed with. So very important. If you get through all 4 of your review cycles and there are still outstanding items that the applicant is not in compliance with, then staff simply provides a letter saying, here are the items that are still out of compliance within this, and it can be denied. And then they would either need to go through an appeal process, or they would have to submit a whole new application and start all over again, if they wanted to make those changes. Questions? Okay, next. We already covered that one here. I'm sure you guys are already compliant in it. February 1 of 2024 was when that went into effect for cities the size of your community here. Yeah, we already covered the other 2 ones, so. Okay, this is just a very quick flow chart to take us through those items. So step 1, if the applicant requests a pre-application meeting, you schedule it within 15 days. Step 2, the applicant submits their complete preliminary subdivision applications. The Administrative Land Use Authority, I had to put it that way because it's an acronym, right? Okay. It has to be reviewed within 15 days. The app review may be completed at the staff level, and you can't have more than 1 public hearing along with that. Now, that is not a requirement, but a local agency can choose to have 1 public hearing. The biggest challenge that I've seen with agencies that have decided to do that is that it can be, again, back to the items for the role of the public. It can be confusing because this is an administrative action that you're talking about. And if you're doing a public hearing, then oftentimes you're going to have members of the public that are going to show up and they're going to believe that their opinions and preferences can actually dictate something that may happen with this application. But this is an administrative process, right? So if you choose to do that, I absolutely recommend there being that notation to the public about, even though this is a public hearing, here are the limitations on what can be considered and what type of things we can take into account. But that is within the statute that you can do that. And then it's important to note that approval is required if all standards are met, regardless of what review cycle you're in. If all the standards are met, don't sit on it. Approve it, move forward, and let everybody move on. Next. So the applicant would then submit their complete final subdivision application, and the Administrative Land Use Authority would need to review that submittal within 20 business days. And then the Administrative Land Use Authority, as step 4, response of the applicant with either approval of the application or their notation on here the items that still need to be addressed. And that request for additional information or modifications, that cycle can't repeat more than that 4 times. And as I said, if you get through that 4th one and there's still deficiencies, staff needs to give the applicant a letter of, here's the outstanding deficiencies that are here and the reason why this item is being denied. They then, and they need to provide them with the provisions of, and this is how you would appeal this decision if you disagree with it. And then the applicant could either go through the appeal process or could take the denial, resubmit a new application, or take the denial and not do anything.
So this might be something, I thought it was only 2 times.
Well, we have 2 in the final, but technically they're afforded 4. That's why I like with Rolling Hills, we would send a comment and then they get more time to respond to us on it.
I thought it was 4 total, so we do 2 at preliminary, 2 at final.
Got it. I thought it meant per like final
First
application.
step.
Yes, and that's why, got it,
There was
okay.
some question about how to interpret that.
Yeah.
Okay, great, okay.
Okay, yeah, next slide. All right, so these get into just, I would say, the most common topics that we typically touch on. But if you're not addressing any of these items right now and you don't have questions about them, I certainly don't want anybody to feel like I'm just going to be up here, preaching to you guys about content that doesn't really matter or is not really applicable, or even if staff feels like, what, that's not really necessary. So annexation, some communities deal with them a lot, some of them very, very rarely. And then others, I would imagine closer to your community are, I don't know if there's any additional area right now where you guys could annex.
There are a few.
Is there? Okay.
Yeah, there's a few.
Yeah, many in the Salt Lake and Ogden metro areas are almost kind of out of their municipal boundary space, right? I will say, on the annexation side, right now, the most significant bill that is going through the legislature that has to do with land use is like 1,700 pages, or excuse me, lines, not pages, like 1,700 lines worth of amended code, and a large portion of that is amending the annexation code. So it has passed through favorably right now out of one committee and is headed through the process, so it looks like it likely will be adopted. The annexation process in Utah, for many, many years, there was two processes. You had one in Salt Lake County and then one for the rest of the state. And that was because in the 90s, in Salt Lake County, you had a lot of agencies that was going through what was kind of referred in the planning world to as the annexation wars. And that was, as growth was happening, you had agencies that were really just trying to kind of land grab an annexation area and get it within their municipal boundary before their neighbor could, right? And so the annexation pressures were a lot different in Salt Lake County than they were, in say like Emory or, Iron County or something like that, where annexation is rare and wasn't needed as often. So they had these two tracks, and over time, they would add and amend little things here and there, and sometimes they would add something to Salt Lake one and they'd say, I like that, let's put that one into the other process. And over the years, in my opinion, it ended up kind of being a Frankenstein approach, right? And it got to the point where it was kind of ugly and unwieldy, and even created a lot of challenge for planners as they were trying to deal with the annexation process. So the goal here was that they got a lot of people that have been engaged in annexation activities, counties, local agencies, all throughout the state, and had some really good conversations over a couple-year period, and it said, we need to have one consistent process that's going to fit for everybody, and it's going to work for everybody, and it's going to remove a lot of those Frankenstein parts that have been put in over time. But there will be some what I would say some significant changes to the overall process, mostly with required communication between a local agency and a county, and public noticing type of items. Overall, the process, I think, though, is going to be a lot better, and it's going to make a lot more sense for communities, even though there certainly will be some growing pains as I think people are trying to figure out some of the subtle nuance changes within there. So I won't jump into it a whole lot simply because of that. I wouldn't want to go through, here's what state law says right now, and then come May, June, July, it's going to change, right? So, but we can absolutely jump into more of that, I would say, after the session, if you guys are interested and you have some annexations coming up. And
We have a minor annexation. We had a little issue where we had a boundary, I don't know if it'd be dispute, but confusion with the county.
Okay.
On the bench, there's an area, and then there's an area north of kind of our west side between us and Farmington that's in the county, but it's part of our annexation policy plan.
Okay.
So we do have two areas. One is where our water tank is that we need to get cured, and the other, like I said, is part of that policy.
And these are processes that have already begun?
We haven't started the annexation
Okay.
process on either.
Okay.
But one is in the policy plan, the other we thought was in the city boundaries up until recently.
Okay.
And we were corrected.
There is language within the code that's being floated right now that of course, anything which is very standard, if it's already started through a process, then the rules that were in place at that time are going to apply. But there is even some language that allows communities to be able to utilize the current rules that are in place, even though a new rule may already come into place if they are, X amount into a process.
Okay.
So yeah, if and when that does pass, take a look at those items. If there's any questions about that, you can reach out to our office and we'd be happy to walk through
Sounds
it with
good,
you.
yeah.
Okay,
Appreciate that.
next slide. That one talks about the annexation
There you go.
policy plan, which Mike had talked about. That's still going to be something that's extremely important. That really lays out if we intend to annex anything, it needs to be identified within this plan. You'll see some improvements if that legislation does pass about required communication with the county and things of that nature that I think are going to improve that process. Next one. CUPs, everybody's favorite topic, right? So conditional use permits, great tools, absolutely wonderful. I have noticed, though, over the last few years that you have some agencies that are actually becoming a lot more interested in pulling back the amount of conditional use permits that they have within their communities. And the reason why is what they're trying to do is just tighten up their rules, the administrative rules and regulations that they have in place that will allow for things to either be permitted or not permitted, and to make it very, very clear about things that are conditional use permits, why they're CUPs, and what type of mitigations and issues that you may have to look into and bring forward. And then instead of having to go even before a planning commission in a public meeting, if you're able to come forward with an application that says, this is a conditional use permit, I understand that this type of use requires 10 items to be addressed: noise, lighting, pedestrian traffic, whatever those items might be that have been identified, if an applicant can come forward and show, I've addressed all of these items in an administrative application, then some agencies are even moving more of their conditional use permits to an administrative process. That said, it's completely up to a community, if they want to have CUPs, how they want to have them implemented, the amount that they want to have. The whole point of them is to acknowledge and understand that there is some uses that, depending on what they are and where they are, can have very different impacts and need to be addressed in very different ways, right? It's not just as simple as setbacks, height restrictions, something of that nature. The most common is going to be items like regional parks or large parks or something of that nature, and you're going to have issues with noise that are going to be unique to that area, issues with lighting that are going to be unique to that area. And so when they're looking at that individual project, while you know that the overall, these are the topics that you might have to cover and discuss, they're going to be different depending on the geography and adjacent neighborhood around it. Then those are what are referred to as the reasonably anticipated detrimental effects. Next slide. These are typically the ones that you will see to be those potential detrimental effects. It's going to be impacts to things like your service levels for your street, your traffic, the adequacy of your utility systems, impacts to connectivity for bicycle, pedestrian, things of that nature. Anything that's going to have a certain use that might have noises or odors or other environmental impacts that may be unique to that use. Their hours of operation. I remember when the Walmarts were first really building, and a lot of the stores were 24 hours, right? That was something that a lot of communities didn't have already, and so that was a large part of the discussion of how do you account for that and their hours of operation there. Signs, exterior lighting, provision of emergency services. Just an example of usually some of the things that you'll see for those detrimental impacts that are addressed within a conditional use permit. Next. Okay, exactions. Does everybody know what an exaction is? Okay, so an exaction, by state law, an exaction is going to be anything that a developer is required to pay for, construct, and or dedicate over to the city, right? Anytime there is dollars associated with something that then becomes is owned or given to the city, the law is going to consider that to be an
So
exaction.
is it similar to like an improvement?
That would
Or they-
include, yes.
Okay.
Public improvements are also considered by law as exactions. So it could be dedication of property, construction and dedication of the public improvements, or any type of monetary payment. So that can include items like your development impact fees. All of those items by law are going to be considered an exaction. And that is just the mandatory contribution that's required by a government as a condition of approval for a development application, if it includes any of those items. Next. To take a look at an exaction, the law utilizes something called the rough proportionality test. And this is a two-part test that says, one, you have to be able to show that there's an essential link that exists between a legitimate government interest and each exaction. So an item like if someone's coming in with a subdivision application and they want to put homes or businesses, you got to have sewer, water items, right? So clearly there is a link between what is required to serve that item, the government interest that is associated with providing that service there, and the fact that they would have to place that in order to have approval and operation of that. And then two, the exaction must be roughly proportionate both in nature and extent to the impact of the proposed development. What that means is if someone were to come in and say, I want to do a subdivision here, my engineering report shows that a half-inch water line can appropriately provide service to this area. The agency can't come back and go, that's great, but we want a 4-inch line because there's deficiencies over here already that we have in this part of the community, and if you guys build here, then probably more people are going to want to build over here, and we don't want to have to come back in the future and tear that out and then have to put in a 4-inch line. You can't require that developer to place that 4-inch line. The only thing that can be required from them is the equivalent of that item that would be the half-inch line. Now, that doesn't mean that the agency can't have communications with a developer about utilizing a reimbursement agreement or capital facilities funds or something of that nature to say, we know that a 4-inch line is going to be required here, or that is what our capital facilities plan shows. This is what we would like to be able to see. You can then work with the developer for the placement of that 4-inch line, but you can't require them to build, pay for, and then dedicate over that 4-inch line, it can only be substantially in proportion to the cost of that half-inch line. Which means, if you were to look at that and say, half-inch line is gonna be $100 a foot, and a 4-inch line is gonna be $250 a foot, the city would need to foot the $150 extra, is how that would need to go in there. You can only charge up to that proportionate share for that. Now, that said, it has been my experience that the vast majority of developers are absolutely happy to have discussions with the agency about those type of expansions and whatnot, because in all honesty, they're digging into the road anyways. They're already placing that type of infrastructure. So if they have the assurance that items are going to be paid for, reimbursed, right, or even fees deferred, things of that nature, there's a lot of different ways that the local agency can work with the developer to provide those type of expansions of a use like that. The vast majority of developers are absolutely happy to do that, especially if it's going to provide even additional, not only positive provision for their individual development, but it's also good faithing between them and the agency. And so oftentimes it ends up being a positive. Next. Okay, so as you're considering those type of items, it's really important to understand the difference between a system improvement and a project improvement. So a system improvement is typically going to be one that is a larger public facility and it's intended to provide services to a larger subset of the community. Sometimes the entire community, sometimes a larger portion of the community, but it goes beyond the bounds of just an individual project that is being put before you. A project improvement is going to be something that is understood to be improvement that is planned and designed just to provide services primarily for that application or that development proposal that is sitting in front of you. The reason why I use that picture that I did here is because if you look at all those interior streets, those streets would not need to exist without this development proposal coming forward, right? So anything that you can look at and say that wouldn't need to exist without this development proposal being put in place, you can typically say that is a project improvement. An item that is going to go beyond that, this particular map here actually had some development at both the north and the south area of it that was a continuation of some city parkway amenities there. And that was considered, they were already within their public facilities plan. And so those were considered, those are an extension to serve the larger community. The items that are being put there, those can be considered to be a system improvement. And the reason why I put the pro tip down there is if a facility is identified in a city's capital facilities plan, then you can typically say, clearly that is a public improvement, right? That is a system improvement and not a project-only improvement because the city has already identified that as a community need. So that can be a really quick way to determine between those two. If there's a question of, is this system or is it project? Take a look at your capital facilities plan, and oftentimes that's going to give you some really good direction. Next. Okay, variances. Do you guys have a lot of variances that you deal with within your community?
Not normally, but
Okay.
more recently, the Board of Adjustments has helped us with a variance a time or two in the last year.
Okay, well, that's good to hear, like 1 or 2 in a year. I think that that's probably more standard. There are some communities that seem to have variance requests on almost every single agenda. And the reason why that can be challenging there is because most often, I can tell you when, in my years as a planner at the counter, when you would have somebody come in and they would say, hey, I would like to do this with my property. And as the planner, you would have to say to them, that's actually not permitted and here's the reasons why. They would then say, oh, well, just give me a variance then, right? Which a lot of people will think a variance is just.
We hear it all the time.
Yeah, of course.
Can I get a
Because
variance?
it's just, let me do what I want to do, right? Give me an exemption from the rules is basically what they're saying. Please let me just do what I want to do and call it a variance. But variances should actually be very, very specific, and they should also be rare within your community. The reason why I say that is because every time you approve a variance, you risk, if it's not meeting certain criteria, you risk undermining the actual authority of your land use ordinances that are in place. And that's when you then turn into the items of, well, my next door neighbor Joe got that, how come I don't get it, right? And if you can't point to very specific criteria of why something needed to apply to Joe to ensure that he had the same level of use of his property and freedom to use his property as the person standing before you, then you're in a very compromised position, right? And it hurts the validity of your land use ordinances. So there are 5 items that you really want to take a look at whenever you have someone come in and they're requesting a variance. So first, you want to say, is literal enforcement of the ordinance causing an unreasonable hardship for the applicant that is not necessary to carry out the general purposes of your land use ordinance, right? So that's number one. Is it an undue burden that is being placed onto this individual property owner? Second, are there special circumstances attached to the property that do not generally apply to other properties in the same zone? So the reason why I utilized this picture was because this is actually a project in the Eastern Sierras. One of those, no communities ever have this. One of those, like, pretty sure that somebody just drew lines on a map, 150 lots created. I don't know if they ever actually even stepped foot on that land themselves. But the lots now exist, and about 5 of the 150 looked like this before the house was on it. These huge rock outcroppings that left almost zero buildable area on the actual legal lot, right? So strict interpretation of the code would have said, well, sorry to those 5 property owners, I guess you guys can place like a little teeny house on there if you have any building area at all. That's all you can do with strict interpretation of the code. That's what that would have been. But again, that would have been an unreasonable hardship for them, and it was a special circumstance that was attached to those individual properties that didn't apply to the vast majority of other properties that were within that same zone district. It was just a handful. So then third, granting the variance is essential to enjoyment of a substantial property right possessed by other property owners in the same zone. You go over just 1 or 2 lots from where this handful of lots were sitting right there, and they could utilize the vast majority, if not all, of their property for building area with strict interpretation of the code and still have plenty of use to utilize their property. But these few could not because of some of those challenges. Next slide. And then, if you can say, giving them a variance will not substantially affect the general plan and it will not be contrary to the public interest, there's no public health and safety issues, anything of that nature that would come along with it, and most importantly, to put the cap on the end of it, is the spirit of the land use ordinance still observed and substantial justice being done to ensure the rules for the community are still applying at large, but you are allowing this flexibility here because of these items that are peculiar to this lot, specific to this lot, and are not necessary to keep the spirit and the intent of that land use ordinance in place for the rest of the community. If those 5 items can be addressed, then a variance absolutely can be appropriate. If any of them cannot be addressed, then a variance should not be considered. And then that's when you get into conversations about potential change of zone request or what they can do on the property within the confines of the land use ordinance. I always like to point out here that unreasonable hardship, so that term is used in the law again and again, especially when it has to do with variances. Unreasonable hardship cannot be self-imposed. So what that means is if this property owner had have actually placed those rocks there, they'd have said, ooh, I love that look, I'm gonna go out and get a bunch of huge rocks and I'm gonna stack them all over the place. You now created that situation for yourself, right? That situation wasn't like that. You created that. So it can't be something that is self-imposed. It also can't be economic only. Somebody couldn't come in and say, well, I'm going to get less out of my property because of this item, either that I've chosen to do or it's just the economics of it alone. If someone says, my property isn't worth as much if I can't do X, Y, and Z, again, that can't be considered solely in a variance. And it has to be something that is peculiar to the property. So if, and the reason why that matters is if it's something that is consistent amongst the majority of the lots that are within that zone district, then it's no longer peculiar, right? They all have that similar type of challenge. Oftentimes you'll see that with something like a canal that's cutting through or something of that nature. The vast majority or even all of the people in that zone district have some type of challenge to deal with there. A variance may not be appropriate to deal with that on an individual property basis. And then special circumstances must relate to the hardship, and you have to be able to show that they're depriving that property of privileges that are basically enjoyed by others within the same zone district. That ties back to that use of private property and the state of Utah being very strong on private property rights. So that's where you have to show those items. Okay, next one. All right. That is the end of the presentation. I think we're just under an hour, right? Is that correct? Okay. Or no, we started at 7, didn't we?
Well, we started, yeah.
Geez, I'm sorry, guys.
Okay.
You're probably like 10 minutes.
And it's almost halftime already, come on.
Okay, so, have you seen the score?
Do you want to know it?
Don't tell me the score, just tell me if I should be smiling or frowning.
Well, you should be smiling.
Okay, that's good to know. Arizona State was shorthanded, right? But we all saw what happened in football. I don't want to talk about that. It still hurts. This is referred to as our Jeopardy board. And so we'll usually end our trainings with, if there's anything up here, these are really the most common items that we seem to get questions about from local agencies, things that they are either struggling with or they're curious about. So if you want to continue any conversations, I'm happy to address any of those items. If you want to say you've already overstayed, you're welcome. Please wrap it up and leave. Can absolutely do that as well. But yeah, always just, the most important thing for us is that we're providing any information and help that's needed by local agencies, because local agencies, you guys are the ones that are doing the real.
I think I'd like just a little bit more information on the accessory dwelling units.
Okay.
We've brought that up before, and I know that we have rules in place for that, but I would just like to hear some more information.
Sure. Yeah, so
That's what I
right.
was going to mention too.
Okay. Right now, internal accessory dwelling units are the only thing that the state directly addresses and says that they have to be, yeah, a lot of
That
times, they have
is
so many
currently-
different names.
That's all that we currently provide. We don't provide external.
And local agencies right now are absolutely able to set regulations, like they can allow external detached units, or they can not allow them, and it's completely up to them. Right now, it's just the internal accessory dwelling unit, often referred to as a mother-in-law unit or a basement apartment, right? There's a million different names for them. But the state law refers to them as internal accessory dwelling units. Those ones are required. You have to be able to allow those. Now, there is very specific criteria within state law that says that an interior accessory dwelling unit is not something like adding an addition onto the back of your house. It is within the existing footprint of the home, right? So if they are looking to add a kitchen downstairs to allow now for a mother-in-law apartment or something of that nature, the city needs to be able to permit and allow those type of items. But they don't have to allow anything that is expanding the size, expanding that type of use. I will say, however, there is a lot of pressure at the state legislature right now and a lot of interest from the legislature in expanding accessory dwelling units to also include either attached, expanding a unit that would share, an existing wall or something of that nature, or even fully detached accessory dwelling.
Tiny homes and whatnot.
Yeah, tiny homes are often going to be pointed to as an example of an external accessory dwelling unit.
Call it a casita sometimes.
Yep, absolutely. Again, probably 30 names for every single one of those items. However they're being marketed by whatever company is putting them out. But there is considerable interest in that right now at the state legislature level. I do believe that you will see, if not this year, next year, some pretty significant adjustments in expansions of accessory dwelling unit placement. Now, I worked many years in the state of California when they were going through their accessory dwelling unit changes and requiring in every single residential zone, including multifamily zone, that you could still add ADUs. And at their legislature, there was conversations like, this is going to be a game changer. We're going to see hundreds of thousands of units come online, and it didn't play out that way, right? I'm not saying that doesn't mean that same type of thing would or would not happen within the state of Utah. But I know that oftentimes local agencies, a lot of the discussion is the fear of, oh my goodness, massive all of a sudden demands on our infrastructure that we didn't have, issues with parking, challenges with crowded neighborhoods, a lot of those type of conversations. Interestingly enough, I didn't see as much of that happen in California as I think a lot of people were afraid were going to happen. There's certainly pockets of areas where you saw more of it happen, and some of those issues certainly did come up and needed to be addressed by a local agency, but by and large, it didn't seem to be the kind of atomic explosion that I think a lot of people really thought it was going to be.
So another question in regards to that. If the state determines whatever it's going to determine about that, we have to abide by that? We can't say, hey, we don't want to do that?
Yeah, it would.
City ordinances.
It would be, so any state actually has they are the ultimate land use authority, and then they actually give land use authority down the line to the local agencies, right? But at any point, they can claw back any of those land use authority details that they want, or they can add criteria and regulation of, you still are the land use authority, but here are the guardrails that you have to operate within. And that would be considered one of those items. The state, up to this point, what they typically have done is something like, you have to do an administrative land use approval for single-family, two-family, and townhomes, right? They've said, here's the criteria that it has to sit within, but it's up to you, for you guys to now decide how you want to do that. With the internal ADUs, it was the same thing. You have to permit them, but it's up to you how you want to put that process in place to permit it. I would imagine that the external or attached accessory dwelling units, if and when those do come online, it would likely be very, very similar.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank
If anything comes up and you guys have questions, concerns, anything like that, please feel free to reach out anytime. We're always happy to either come back and do another training. We're always happy to do them remote as well, if that works better for your agency, or even just provide information to staff. If a planning commissioner has a question, hey, will you reach out to the ombudsman and ask about X, Y, and Z? And is there any resources? Is there any templates? Is there any white papers? We're happy to make sure that we find those items and get them sent to you guys, and just hopefully be able to provide as much support as you guys need to do the real job.
Well, thank you very much.
Where does the name
Absolutely.
ombudsman come from? I don't,
The term?
yeah.
Man, I wish it's like, the lead attorney in our office told me one time, he was like, well, it's actually Latin for blah, and I was like, you lost me at Latin.
It's not in my everyday vocabulary.
Taking of or something.
My understanding is it came from Senator
For
Adams
protection.
and a gentleman named Gary
They're
Crane,
awesome.
That wouldn't surprise me.
who had some experience back east.
Really?
Yeah, they're very common back east. States will usually have like 15 or 20 ombudsmen over different things, might be elder care and,
They call them.
but the property rights ombudsman is, at least up to this point, specific to Utah. There's not another one that we know of in the contiguous US.
Okay. Cool.
So, yeah. Okay, guys, thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Mr. Terry. That was excellent.
Yeah, you did a great job.
All right, moving on to agenda item C1, Community Development Director's Report.
Yep, thank you. Just a quick update. We had a city council meeting. There was a work session prior to city council meeting regarding the general plan. And we had Chris Hutt there presenting at the conclusion of the discussion about the general plan. Well, backing up, we talked about the public outreach and public input up to that point, post the open house that was on the 30th, and got some guidance and feedback from the city council. The city council felt like that we should go and do some further outreach, so there was a directive to the city staff and the contracted group to do a flyer mailer to all households with a QR code to participate in a survey. So we're working on that, and that will come out hopefully within the next couple of weeks. Try to update you maybe by the time we have our next planning commission meeting, it will have been mailed out. I'll give you an update at that point, but that is in process. So the side effect of doing that, it will delay the outcome likely of the general plan. So we're probably looking more like June to August timeframe, whereas before it was more May, June. So that's kind of what it's feeling like, but we'll keep you updated there. Talking about your next meeting on the 12th, we do have a code amendment discussion that we'll bring forward. If you want to kind of, I guess, give some window dressing on what that is. At our last city council meeting, one of the main agenda items was relative to Ms. Hutchins' request on the fine line tattoos and tattooing. Ultimately, it was denied by the city council, but there are some issues relative to our own city code that we need to look at, and so you'll see a code amendment language that's being sponsored more by the city this time relative to those concerns at our next meeting on the 12th. Following that, we would then anticipate likely setting up a public hearing on the 26th to respond to that, so just be ready for that discussion. The other item, we also have a few land use items that will likely be on your agenda on the 12th, and a rezone as well. So we anticipate a conceptual commercial subdivision request to be on that meeting on the 12th, and then a plat amendment request. Also, in conjunction with that plat amendment request, there will be a rezone and a PDO amendment request. So, and PDO is a zoning tool linked to the agreement. So for that reason, the rezone and the PDO zone will come together, and that's over in the Summerhill Lane project area. So those are the big items that will be on the agenda on the 12th as a primer. So if you're wanting to try to remember what happened with Summerhill Lane the first, second, and third time that we did approve and amend it, it might be good to remind yourself and get ready for that conversation with this fourth one, so.
So, are you gonna send out any information on that?
Oh, yeah, it's just where we're dealing with Summerhill Lane area. There'll be
Right.
some similarities to previous reviews and discussions on it.
Oh, I see what you're
Yeah.
saying, okay.
Yeah, so we'll be bringing that forward. Other than that, I don't really have anything.
Wonder how much longer this meeting is gonna last.
Not very much longer.
What's
If
that?
if you could just wait, yeah, we're almost done.
Okay,
Thank you.
great, thanks.
Other than that, I don't really have any other things to report unless you have questions for me.
A question, when are we going to be involved with the general plan meetings? Or when are we supposed to be?
There have already been a presentation to the planning commission.
Right.
For the public comment period, but a final draft document hasn't even been put out yet.
Right,
So when a final draft document has actually been put out, it'll be available to the public, and then there'll eventually be a presentation to the planning commission for commentary and guidance with the public hearing, and then a recommendation to the city council. So we're not even close to that point
Right.
of the process yet.
I just didn't know if we were supposed to be doing.
Not at this
something.
point, no, the public comment, we haven't even closed that public comment. And so, because that's, like I said, that's delayed it. Like, by now, on the original timeline, there would have been a draft document, but we haven't been able to even get to the point of having a draft document to start looking at because of the delay on the public commentary element.
No, that's good that they're doing
So-
more.
Yeah. So for that reason, there hasn't been more of a formal presentation to the planning commission as of yet.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay,
We as staff haven't even the final draft plan yet, let's put it that way.
okay.
Yeah. That's it. That's all I
Thank
have.
you.
Excellent. Moving on to the minutes, along with the most recent corrections. Does anybody have any issues, questions, or concerns with the minutes from January 22nd?
I didn't get to read them because
didn't.
I wasn't home today and I didn't get them, or I couldn't open them on my.
Yeah, I apologize for that. So I said I sent out that email earlier when I realized.
Okay, but I didn't see anything today because I wasn't.
Yeah, not a
home,
problem.
but- So I haven't read them.
Anybody?
Do you want me to speed read?
No comments.
Yeah, I didn't have any issue. I'll take a motion.
I
I
move to
approve.
accept the minutes as written.
I second that motion.
Okay, motion and a second. Anybody, or everybody in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, passes unanimously. Take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I second that.
All right, motion and second on the table. Everybody in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.